Heimo and Edna Korth chose a life most people wouldn't survive a life in Alaska's brutal, unforgiving wilderness for over 40 years. They've depended on their skills, instincts, and each other to survive some of the harshest conditions on Earth. But their journey hasn't been just about resilience. It's also been marked by deep heartbreak. Behind the stunning landscapes and self-sufficient lifestyle lies a story of unimaginable loss. What tragedy nearly broke them? And why, after everything, do they still refuse to leave the land that has given them so much, yet taken even more? To truly understand what we're about to uncover, we need to go back to where it all began. Heimo and Edna are a rare breed, true off-the-grid survivalist, living deep in Alaska's Arctic National Wildlife Refuge. It's one of the most remote places on Earth, and hardly anybody lives there. In fact, the Korths are among the last to do it, the old way, relying entirely on the land to survive. But Heimo Korth wasn't born into this life. He came from Appleton, Wisconsin, a town that, while not massive, was still way bigger than Fairbanks and Juneau combined at the time. His parents, Eric and Irene, weren't outdoorsy, even though his dad had grown up on a farm. He never learned to hunt, trap, or fish. Instead, he worked in a factory, providing a steady, predictable life. Heimo tried that life too, working in a factory back in Wisconsin, but it wasn't for him. He had always felt drawn to the wild, even as a kid, growing up in the suburbs. While other kids ran toward town, he did the opposite, just a short walk away. There were open fields and woods waiting to be explored. Most of the time, he went alone, not because he had to, but because nobody else seemed to share his love for it. By the time he was a teenager, that pull toward the wilderness was too strong to ignore. In 1973, at just 18 years old, he set off for Canada's Northwest Territories, chasing his dream. But this was during the Vietnam War, and an 18-year-old heading north raised eyebrows. Many assumed he was dodging the draft, and people weren't exactly welcoming. Still, he was determined to carve out a place for himself in the wild. His first job was as an assistant to a hunting guide, but the pay was so bad he could barely afford rent and food. Eventually, he had no choice but to return to Wisconsin. But the wilderness never stopped calling him. Then he got a break, an opportunity in Alaska, working for a guide who hunted big game in the Brooks Range. He was 20 years old when he stepped into the wilderness for good, and he never came back after working with a hunting guide. For a while, he got hooked up with a friend who ran a trapping line. In addition to giving him advice, this friend in Alaska gave him food traps, supplies, and the entire setup before flying him to a remote cabin in the middle of nowhere. For 3 long months, he struggled to learn how to trap and nearly starved. And, to make matters worse, he fell through the ice on the river and lost nearly everything he owned. With no real way out, he wrote a letter to his former boss requesting assistance, and to his surprise, his boss sent him a check for $500, which was just enough to return to town and regroup. But something had shifted. The wilderness had a hold on him now. He knew this was the kind of life he wanted. He spent the rest of that first winter on St. Lawrence Island, a tiny Eskimo village way out in the Bering Sea, just 90 m from Siberia. That's where he met Edna, though they didn't start dating right away. Now, Edna was born on January 25, 1954, as part of the Yupik people. Her native name is May Doon. Growing up in the community meant knowing how to fish hunt and survive off the land. Her uncle Jackson Mook was a master at trapping by then. Heimo had become close to Edna's father Emerson and spent a lot of time with them. He even took him under his wing, teaching him the ins and outs of trapping and fur preparation. It didn't take long for Jackson to realize that Heimo had a thing for Edna, especially when Jackson jokingly called Edna Heimo's wife. But Hao wasn't trying to admit anything. Everybody's business, and he wasn't about to be at the center of the gossip mill. Heimo kept himself busy helping CS run the village store, and learning to hunt from the best in town. When spring rolled around, he left for Beaver Creek, a river in the White Mountains near Fairbanks. A friend had a cabin out there, and needed someone to look after their dogs for the summer, so Hao packed up and headed back into the wild for the next 2 winters. Hao was deep in the Brooks Range, a brutal stretch of mountains where survival was anything but easy. In Alaska they call it hungry country for a reason. There just aren't many animals out there. Trapping was rough, food was scarce, and the cold was relentless. With deep snow and freezing temperatures, every single day was a battle. He might not have made a fortune, but those winters shaped him into a true mountain man. He proved, without a doubt, that he could not only survive, but thrive in one of the harshest environments on Earth. After searching far and wide, Heimo finally found what he was looking for: a place along the Colline River. This river, a smaller offshoot of the Porcupine River, was tucked away deep in Alaska's wilderness. He needed a spot where he could trap enough fur to make a living, but by the time he arrived, most of the best trapping grounds around the Yukon Flats were already claimed by other trappers. But his friend Bob had already been trapping there and invited Heimo to join him further upriver, so Heimo trekked about 50 mi upstream, not realizing he was stepping into the very place that would become his home for life. 3 years later, he made his way back to Songa EXC, excited to see Edna again. But the moment he laid eyes on her, it hit him just how lonely he'd been without her all that time. For their first date, they kept it simple but unforgettable. They went fishing for Dolly Varden, took a motorcycle ride, and topped it off with pizza. By the late 1970s, Edna made the trip to Hao's cabin in the mountains. It was her first time seeing the place he had built, and she wasted no time pushing him to improve it. She told him he needed to start building a real home for her, though even she wasn't sure if it was the right move. But once she said it, she stuck to it, so Heimo got to work. He had no choice but to finish before winter. So for a solid week, he worked like a man possessed. Just as the first snowflake started falling, he put the last piece in place. Hao and Edna got married in 1982. And for most of the year, they had no running water, no electricity, and no connection to the outside world. Every fall, they hunted and trapped, stocking up enough to survive the long, brutal winters. Now, Edna's life had already seen its share of heartbreak before she met Heimo. She had been engaged to a Swedish biologist, and together they had 2 children, Melinda and Merlin. But tragedy struck when her fiancé died in a plane crash, leaving her alone to raise their children. It was a devastating loss, and the weight of single motherhood rested heavily on her shoulders. Her next relationship didn't bring much comfort either. Her uncle saw firsthand that the man she dated after wasn't good for her, unfaithful and unreliable. So when Hao came into the picture, her uncle was. Though she only lived with them for a portion of the year, Edna's son lived with her parents full-time in Sauna. It was common for children to be raised by grandparents or other relatives, but that didn't make it any easier for Edna. Leaving them behind, even for a few months, was painful. Careful, he wanted to be sure that this man was different, that he would treat Edna right in time. Hao proved himself by adopting Melinda, understood that her parents could give her children the stability she couldn't guarantee in the wilderness. 4 months after their wedding, Edna and Heimo welcomed their first daughter together, and they named her Colin, after the Colin River. Colleen was like a little wildflower full of life and curiosity. She spent summers picking blueberries, splashing in the river with Edna and riding on Hao's shoulders. But more than anything, she loved to explore. She had a habit of wandering off, so Edna sewed a little bell onto her coat to keep track. She was fascinated by the moon as well. Whenever it appeared in the sky, Hao would lift her up so she could see it better. She would point excitedly and call out "Moo-moo" as the family took their evening walks along the river. Then, just 5 days after her second birthday, Colin drowned in a river accident, and her body was never found. Her family and friends were so devastated that they urged the Korths to leave the bush and start over somewhere else. That day, when they got back to their cabin, Howe carved a wooden cross for Colleen. He carefully etched her name and the dates of her brief life into it. That fall, he and Edna carried the cross up a small mountain overlooking the valley and the river. They placed it there as a marker of their love and loss, determined to honor their daughter. Her laughter still echoed in the wind, and her little footprints were still in the dirt. Leaving would feel like abandoning her memory. Petitioned the Board of Geographic Names, but they were constantly told that Colin wasn't deemed historically significant enough. They collected signatures and did everything that was asked of them, but the response remained the same, so eventually they had to let it go. However, despite their grief, Howe and Edna refused to give up the life they had created. They were devoted to the wilderness and the land they had chosen. To put it in perspective, if a couple in Dallas lost a child in a car accident, would they leave just to avoid the pain? No, because it was their home, and that's how he and Edna felt. Even decades later, they still cry when they think about Colleen. The grief never truly went away. But they continued on, and eventually they had 2 more daughters, Rhonda and Kren. They also established a family custom whereby they would occasionally travel up the mountain to the location where they had planted Colin's cross. Years went by, but the wilderness remained home, and Howe took pride in the life they had created there, preserving a way of life that had been practiced for thousands of years. What began as an adventure turned into their way of life. Then, in 1992, Heimo Korth's life in the wild came to the public's attention when he appeared in the National Geographic special Braving Alaska. At first, he was hesitant about the show, fearing it would portray his life in the mountains negatively. But he ultimately took a chance and was pleased with the outcome, which followed 4 families deep in the Alaskan wilderness. And it was a unique opportunity to see a young Heimo Edna and their kids when they were still young. Another family that was highlighted was the Hayden family, who lived on the Coos River. One of them, Susan Hayden, was only a teenager when she started running her dog team and trapping. Years later, she and her brother returned to their old house, and Susan even made a few appearances on the Last Alaskans. Fast forward to 2003, when Howe's cousin James Campbell, a writer, wrote him a letter expressing his desire to write a book about Howe's life. He was intrigued, but after giving it some thought, he chose to give Campbell a chance. James traveled from Wisconsin to Alaska and spent a whole season with the Korth family, living as they did and witnessing firsthand the harsh cold, loneliness, and everyday hardships of surviving in one of the most hostile environments on the planet. This experience became the basis for the 2004 book The Final Frontiersman, which told the tale of Howe and his family's life in the wild. It was a best-selling, captivating, and full of unadulterated, real-life adventure in 2009. Vice Media. When Howe unexpectedly found himself on Flying Wild Alaska in 2012, all he wanted was a flight to Fairbanks. So he reached out to the show star, who happened to be a pilot. The next thing he knew, he was on TV again. They then filmed Howe's Arctic Refuge, also known as Surviving Alone in Alaska, a documentary that gave an unfiltered look at Howe and Edna's life in the wilderness. It's the kind of film that draws you in not just because of the breathtaking, harsh scenery, but also because of the people who live there. And his family really became well known at that point. The Last Alaskans debuted on Animal Planet, which followed a few families in the Arctic National Wildlife Refuge, one of the most isolated locations in America. It chronicled their joys, hardships, and how they managed to build a life where most people wouldn't survive a week. The show ran for 4 seasons, totaling 36 episodes, and by the time it ended in January 2019, it had amassed a devoted following. In the first episode, Howe expressed his enthusiasm for the Alaskan way of life, saying, "This is an adventure. This is joy. You're bound to nature. Nature directs your path," which was the truth for them. Howe reportedly made about $3,000 per episode of The Last Alaskans, but money was never the driving force. This was the life he and Edna had chosen for, better or worse. And the show didn't just capture the good times. The Last Alaskans never shied away from the truth, despite its success. The show was costly to produce, which is part of the reason it only lasted 4 seasons. However, what made the show stand out was its authenticity. Unlike other Alaska-based reality shows that leaned into drama or exaggerated danger, this one stayed true to real life. There were no staged arguments or people trying to become famous. It also showed the heartbreak, such as when they lost their 2-year-old daughter Colleen in a canoeing accident. In 2016, James Campbell bravely revisited Howe's story and brought his daughter along to experience life at Howe's cabin. It was an intriguing look at how things had changed, or perhaps how they hadn't, and how some people were born into it, carrying on generations-old traditions, while others had moved to Alaska in search of solitude and purpose. A few years later, Howe and Edna's 3 daughters, Millie, Rhonda, and Kren, had all grown up and settled into their own lives in Fairbanks, far from the remote wilderness where they were raised, but it's evident that the wild still calls to them. The youngest, Kren, feels the pull the most, and she and her husband are planning to move closer to their parents, bringing their son, Colby, along for the adventure. Despite the distance, the family remains connected, and every summer, Howe and Edna travel back to Fairbanks to spend time with them. But as soon as fall arrives, they return to the only life they've ever really known, out in the wild. He is regarded as one of the best wolverine trappers in North America, and Howe still earns a living the old-fashioned way by running trap lines that span hundreds of miles through the snow-covered wilderness. He rides a snowmobile across those vast, frozen landscapes, tracking and trapping wolves, wolverines, foxes, martens, and beavers. Edna also traps, but she stays closer to home and focuses on the necessities. She still makes their winter gear by hand, crafting Howe, who is still strong and full of energy, says he hopes to spend the rest of his days out there in the only place that has ever felt like home. The years are passing, and being so far from their family isn't always easy. But no matter what, Howe and Edna always return to the cabin when winter arrives, because it's the land that life is in their blood.